I paid for a dream trip to Europe for my parents and me, something I had been saving for years to make happen. But when I arrived at their house to pick them up, everything changed. For years, I had dreamed of giving my parents the gift of a lifetime. A trip to Europe, something they'd always talked about but never felt they could afford. So, when I finally managed to save enough, it felt like a victory not just for me but for our entire family. Every detail had been meticulously planned. The hotels were booked, the flights confirmed, and even the itinerary was crafted to include their favorite landmarks and experiences. I couldn't wait to see their faces light up as we explored places they'd only ever seen on TV or read about in books. That morning, I was buzzing with excitement. The car was packed, and I made sure to pick up their favorite coffee on my way over. Pulling into their driveway, I rehearsed in my mind the joyful send-off we'd share before embarking on this adventure. But as I stepped out of the car, my heart sank. There, standing on the porch with a suitcase in hand, was my younger sister, Jessica. Her carefree grin stretched wide, as if she didn't have a care in the world. My parents emerged from the house, their faces lit with excitement. My mother, in her usual casual tone, announced that Jessica would be going with them instead of me. "She's been so stressed lately," my mom added, as if that explained anything. "She needs this more than you do." I stared at them, dumbfounded. The words didn't make sense at first, like a cruel joke that hadn't landed. This was my gift, my effort, my dream, and they were taking it away without a second thought. Jessica's smug look only added salt to the wound. She didn't even try to hide her glee as she wheeled her suitcase toward the car. Years of memories flooded back. Jessica being the golden child, always the center of attention. Her mistakes were excused, her needs prioritized, while I was left to pick up the pieces or fade into the background. I had hoped that this trip would be different, that it would show them how much I cared. Instead, it became another chapter in the same old story. I swallowed my anger, forcing myself to smile as I helped load their luggage into the trunk. My hands shook with the effort it took to hold back tears. I couldn't let them see how much this hurt. Not here, not now. They didn't deserve that satisfaction. Instead, I nodded and went along with their decision because what choice did I have? The car ride to the airport was unbearable. Jessica chatted nonstop about how excited she was, dropping comments about how she deserved this break. My parents chimed in occasionally, talking about the places they'd visit, completely ignoring the fact that I was supposed to be there. I felt like an outsider in my own family, a ghost sitting silently in the driver's seat while they planned their adventure without me. As I drove, something shifted inside me. A quiet, simmering rage replaced the sadness. I realized that this wasn't just about the trip. It was about every time I'd been overlooked, every sacrifice I'd made that went unnoticed, every moment when I'd put them first only to be pushed aside. This wasn't love or family. This was betrayal, plain and simple. By the time we reached the airport, my resolve had hardened. I helped them unload their bags, exchanged polite goodbyes, and even wished them a good trip. But as I drove away, the weight of years of neglect and unacknowledged effort pressed down on me. I knew one thing for certain. I was done being the one they overlooked, the one who always gave without question. It was time for things to change. Driving back home from the airport, I could feel the silence around me turning into something sharper, more focused. By the time I walked into my apartment, I had made up my mind. They didn't deserve the trip I had planned, paid for, and dreamed about for years. I had poured so much of myself into making it special, only to be replaced without a second thought. If they wanted to prioritize Jessica, they could figure everything else out too. I opened my laptop and began canceling everything, the hotels, the tours, the dinner reservations at places my parents had always talked about. Each cancellation felt like a small release, a weight lifting off my shoulders. For once, I wasn't cleaning up after them or bending over backward to make things easier. I wasn't sure what they'd do when they landed in Europe, but frankly, I didn't care. It was their mess now. When their flight touched down, the calls started almost immediately. My phone buzzed incessantly, with notifications. First, it was my mom. Her voice on the voicemail was tight with irritation, explaining that the hotel had no record of their booking. Then Jessica chimed in with a long string of angry texts about how I had ruined everything. Even my dad, who rarely got involved, left a clipped message asking me to fix this mix-up. I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to avoid the confrontation entirely, but I knew that wouldn't last. So, I waited until the next morning after their messages had piled up and called my mom back. The tension in her voice was palpable as she demanded to know what had happened. I told her the truth. Calmly, plainly, I explained that I had canceled everything because they decided I wasn't part of the trip. I reminded her that this was supposed to be my gift to them, and by choosing Jessica over me, they had forfeited the effort I'd put in. Her reaction was immediate and predictable. She accused me of being petty and immature, of ruining what should have been a happy time for the family. But I stood my ground. For the first time in years, I didn't apologize or try to smooth things over. I simply told her that they'd made their decision, and now they'd have to live with it. Her frustration quickly turned into outright anger. She sputtered through excuses, trying to make it seem like their choice was logical and fair. But the more she talked, the more obvious it became that she wasn't used to me pushing back. Jessica's voice rang out in the background, whining about how she was the victim in all this. It was almost comical to hear them scrambling, blaming each other for not double-checking the bookings. They had taken my efforts for granted for so long that the idea of handling things themselves was completely foreign to them. When my mom tried to guilt me into fixing things, I cut her off. I told her that I wouldn't be their safety net anymore. My voice stayed steady, even as she hurled accusations at me. It felt strange and exhilarating, standing up for myself after so many years of being the reliable, quiet daughter who never made waves. I ended the call before she could say anything else and turned my phone off. Sitting there in the silence, I felt an unexpected sense of relief. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I wasn't weighed down by their expectations or demands. I wasn't their go-to problem solver, their fallback plan. I was just me, free to focus on what I wanted and needed. Of course, I knew this wasn't over. The fallout would come, and it wouldn't be pretty. But for now, I allowed myself a moment to enjoy the peace. I looked around my apartment and realized how much I had neglected my own space and life while pouring so much energy into theirs. It felt symbolic, almost to start fresh. I made a list of things I'd been putting off, small, simple goals that were just for me. Taking control of my life in this small way felt like the first real step toward something better. But I knew the storm was brewing. They wouldn't let this go quietly. And as much as I wanted to enjoy the newfound freedom, a part of me braced for the next wave of conflict, knowing that this was only the beginning. The following days were a whirlwind of calls and messages from my family. My mother's voicemails alternated between anger and melodrama, painting herself as the victim of my supposed cruelty. Jessica's texts accused me of being petty and vindictive, while my father tried to appeal to my sense of responsibility, telling me it wasn't too late to fix everything. It was exhausting but not surprising. They had always assumed I would step in to clean up their messes. This time, though, I stayed firm. Every notification I ignored felt like a small victory, a step further away from years of bending to their will. In the quiet moments, the weight of their words lingered. I revisited memories of birthdays spent in Jessica's shadow, my plans sacrificed for her whims, and my efforts dismissed as expected. This was the pattern I had endured for so long, but this time, I couldn't allow it to continue. One evening, as doubt started to creep in, my best friend Kelly showed up at my door. She knew something was wrong the moment she saw me. I told her everything, from the canceled trip to the guilt-laden accusations. She listened, her concern turning into quiet anger on my behalf. Kelly reminded me that this wasn't just about the trip. It was about years of putting myself last. Her words cut through the doubt, reigniting the determination I had felt when I canceled those bookings. Setting boundaries wasn't selfish, it was necessary. Over the next few hours, Kelly's support helped me see that this moment was a turning point. I didn't have to keep playing the role of the dutiful daughter. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a different path, one where my needs mattered. By the time she left, I felt lighter, as though I'd shed a skin that no longer fit. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't just going to hold my ground. I was going to reclaim my life. The trip was just the beginning. I started writing a list of things I wanted to do for myself, goals and experiences I had denied myself for years. It wasn't about being spiteful. It was about rediscovering who I was outside of my family shadow. As I wrote, a sense of clarity washed over me. I wasn't just rejecting their control. I was embracing my own agency. For the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be mine to walk. And that was enough. A week later, they returned. My parents and Jessica arrived back from their chaotic, improvised trip looking exhausted and irritable. Despite everything, I decided to meet them. It wasn't an easy choice, but I knew this was my chance to say everything I had held back for years. I stood at the doorstep, calm and resolute, as they shuffled inside, their irritation practically radiating off them. Jessica started the moment she saw me, her voice dripping with scorn. She tried to turn the situation into my fault, accusing me of being heartless and immature for leaving them stranded. My mother, following suit, launched into a tirade about how the trip had been a disaster and how she never thought I could be so cruel. My father, ever the peacemaker, attempted to diffuse the tension by suggesting we talk it out calmly. But I wasn't here to be talked down or guilt into submission. For once, I didn't shrink away from their anger. I took a deep breath and let the years of frustration flow out. I spoke about everything they had ignored, from the countless sacrifices I made to the way my efforts were taken for granted. I reminded them of all the times I had put their needs above my own, only to be dismissed or overshadowed by Jessica. My voice was steady, but my words carried the weight of a lifetime of neglect. Jessica rolled her eyes, muttering that I was overreacting and being dramatic. My mother tried to interrupt, her tone defensive, but I held up a hand to stop her. I told them that this wasn't about the trip. It was about the pattern they had created, where my worth was measured by how much I could give them, while they gave me nothing in return. My father, for the first time, looked genuinely uncomfortable. He mumbled something about trying harder in the future, but it sounded hollow, almost like an afterthought. Jessica's dismissive attitude stung, but I didn't let it derail me. I looked at her directly and said that I wasn't willing to be the family's fixer anymore. If they wanted to keep living in their bubble where Jessica's whims were the priority, they could, but I wouldn't be a part of it. My mother's reaction was the loudest, a mix of shock and outrage. She accused me of abandoning my family, of turning my back on the people who loved me. But her words felt empty, like a broken record of guilt she had used too many times before. I told her that loving someone didn't mean letting them exploit you. For years, I had convinced myself that enduring their treatment was my way of showing love. Now I saw it for what it was, a cycle I needed to break. The conversation reached a boiling point, with my mother nearly shouting and Jessica huffing dramatically. My father's attempts to mediate fell flat, as I refused to budge. Finally, I said the words I had been holding back. From now on, I'm living my life for myself. Not for you. Not for Jessica. For me. The room fell silent. They stared at me, stunned, as if the idea of me prioritizing myself was something they had never even considered. I didn't stay long after that. I had said what I needed to say. As I walked out the door, I felt an unexpected sense of relief, like a heavy weight had been lifted off my shoulders. The toxic hold they had over me was finally broken. I didn't know what the future would hold, but for the first time, it felt like it was truly mine to shape. Leaving my family's house that day felt like stepping into a new chapter. For the first time in years, I wasn't weighed down by their expectations or demands. My life was finally mine to navigate, and I didn't want to waste a moment. That evening, I sat down with a notebook and began planning what I wanted for myself. The list started small: a photography course I had always been curious about, exploring parts of the city I had never visited, and even the idea of traveling alone, something I had never dared to do before. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into these plans. The photography course became a source of joy I hadn't felt in years. Capturing moments through a lens helped me see the world differently, and it gave me something that was entirely mine. On weekends, I wandered through hidden corners of the city, discovering cafes, parks, and bookstores that I had always been too busy to notice. Each small step felt like reclaiming a part of myself that had been lost. But the biggest change came when I booked a solo trip to Italy. The decision was both terrifying and exhilarating. I'd never traveled alone before, but the thought of exploring a new place without anyone dictating my itinerary was too appealing to resist. I packed light, armed with a camera, a journal, and an open mind, ready to embrace whatever came my way. Italy was everything I had hoped for, and more. I wandered through the cobblestone streets of Rome, Florence, and Venice, letting myself get lost in the beauty of ancient architecture and vibrant culture. Each day was a revelation, filled with small joys, the taste of fresh gelato, the sound of street musicians, and the serenity of sitting by a canal as the sun set. For the first time, I felt completely free, unburdened by the expectations of others. My journal filled with observations and reflections, capturing the sense of renewal I felt with each passing day. During one quiet afternoon in a small Tuscan village, I sat on a hillside overlooking vineyards that stretched as far as the eye could see. It was there that I wrote a list of goals for myself, not for anyone else, just me. They weren't grand or ambitious, but they were honest. I wanted to continue exploring new hobbies, nurture the friendships that truly mattered, and travel to more places that inspired me. Most importantly, I wanted to live with intention, making choices that aligned with my happiness and well-being. By the time I returned home, I felt like a different person. The confidence and clarity I had gained during my trip made it easier to resist the pull of my family's old dynamics. Predictably, they tried to bring me back into their orbit. My mother called with complaints about Jessica. My father suggested a family dinner to move past everything, and even Jessica sent a half-hearted apology text, clearly hoping to smooth things over. But I stood firm. I listened without engaging, politely declined invitations, and redirected the conversation when they tried to guilt me. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Each time I chose myself over their expectations, it felt like another victory. I no longer felt the need to explain or justify my choices. The life I was building was enough proof that I was on the right path. The weight of their control had lifted, replaced by a sense of freedom I hadn't known I was capable of experiencing. As I settled back into my daily routine, I realized how much had changed. The Ailsa, who once bent over backward to keep the peace, no longer existed. In her place was someone who understood the value of boundaries and self-worth. My journey wasn't over, but for the first time in years, I was excited to see where it would take me.